Politicians have their own views. Power is a narcotic. But I think there are things that I wouldn't quite rank as conspiracy theory, but there are things that have worried me for a long time. And one of them was the post World War II period. And it was a remarkable period to live through. Um, After the war, you had, millions of soldiers returning home. You had the GI Bill. People who otherwise would not have afforded college were going to college. Working people in steel mills, machinists in Western Mass, and so on, all could afford homes and cars and live well. The house I live in Newton, Mass, which is now a prosperous suburb, I bought from a janitor.
Wow.
Uh, and this was, I think, magnificent. This was the beginning of the Cold War, also the post-war period, and your family was in Russia,
Hmm.
and so here in the workers' paradise, people were not doing so well, and here in capitalist America, people had houses and cars and were working and had dignity and so on. Normally, I would think people would be happy about that. My wife, for instance, grew up in France, lived in France during the war. Um, she came to America in 1956 or something, seven, to go to college. Her mother had gone to college in Ohio, and they were sending kids from Europe, mainly Americans returning from Europe, on former troop boats. And so she was with a lot of young people, and all of them expressing a hatred for America.
Hmm. On their
And
way to America, though?
yeah, they were returning to America from Europe. They were Americans.
Oh, I see.
And, they were full of infatuation of sophisticated Europe, and look at how uh, plebeian America is. And I saw this when I was in college. Um, Samuelson's book on economics, I don't know if it's still used, Samuelson and someone else now, was saying, communism was obviously superior. And you had Pete Seeger. I don't know if you remember the folk singer, Pete
Hmm.
Seeger.
Yeah, for sure.
Little houses made of ticky tack, sort of denigrating the aesthetics of these people who now had houses and cars. Um, so that really permeated a lot of thinking that there was something wrong with ordinary working people living the same way as wealthy people used to live. And I can't help feeling that still permeates a lot of thinking. The Vietnam War accentuated that in a great way. Remember, this was a war where they finally, at the end, got rid of the draft, but they had the draft. So what happened? People who didn't go to college went to war. People who could afford to went to college and got draft deferments. So the first time we had divided the society. And what did the people who had deferments say? That they were superior, that this was an evil war. You can have your own views on it. I often wondered why were people fleeing from the north to the south rather than vice versa. But didn't matter. All through universities, by this time I was teaching, everyone was against the war. And if you were on a plane, people were on planes and there were veterans on the plane. They wouldn't sit next to them. And remember, the veterans all were essentially working class. So you have this divide in America, and it's been growing. and it's worrisome. Now the whole thing is continuing. We've gotten rid of manufacturing, and you go to Western Massachusetts, and they're disaster zones where
Mm.
people used to be machinists or workers in factories. They're now on fentanyl. I mean, so I think part of this is part of a gestalt, kind of attitude formation. And of course, by now, what percentage of the population is going to college? It's huge.
Mhm.
And in many cases, it makes no sense. I mean, my wife likes to pick up used books, and she picked up one that was a book called Mathematics for Tradesmen. It was from England. It was from the 1930s. And I looked at it, and I have the feeling most of our freshmen at MIT couldn't handle it.
Mm.
And so, this push to put everyone in college means we're withdrawing people we need in machining and carpentry and the trades because those fields need skills. And, so I think one problem in thinking about your question, is there a deep plot or anything, is to recognize that the problem is multifaceted and it's coming from a variety of directions. The women's movement played a major role. Obviously, when I was a kid, women had very few choices. They could be nurses, secretaries, teachers, housewives, maybe a clerk in a supermarket or something. But of these, teaching was probably one of the best choices in some sense. And so my teachers, both women and men, for different reasons, were outstanding. By 30 years ago, 40 years ago, women had hugely more choices, and teaching was not high among them for most. And if you go to an ed school, any place, including Harvard, the standards are much lower than in the disciplinary departments. And they're basically indoctrination centers. And so you're turning out teachers who may not be very good at math and may not be very good at English, and they're teaching our kids. And the first generation of these kids who are taught by people who are no longer taking teaching as an elite occupation are now in their 50s,
Mm.
and they're CEOs of companies. And so, you gradually modify a society in very profound ways.
Mm.
And what, yeah, like what is the result of that? How does that feed back into the climate narrative?
Well, in the climate narrative, it depends on how you look at it. But look at what you're doing. You're increasing the cost of housing. You're telling people they can't have cars. You're telling them that they have to get rid of their gas stoves. You're telling them that they can't heat their house with fossil fuels. They need heat pumps. Many of these things are both inefficient, ineffective, and too expensive. So you're basically telling ordinary people, come back to where you belong. You don't deserve your house. You don't deserve your car. And, that's underlying a lot of this. There's no question that the people who are earning a couple of $100,000 or $1 million a year, they're not going to be affected by this. And, John Kerry is a bit of a cartoon character, but, I'm very important. So, of course, I have to fly private aircraft.
Mm. Well, that's always this idea of a restriction that is not for me, but it is for you, is a
Yeah.
pretty common feature of these sorts of puritanical perspectives. And the
Well,
idea that we have
the Puritans, to be fair, were puritanical.
which do you mean? Do you mean to point to their success as a consequence of the?
No. What I'm saying is, in the early Bay State, Cameron, Massachusetts,
Mhm.
the Puritans often were religiously committed to Puritanism, and
I think that people are still religiously committed to these sorts of
these
philosophies
are
and perspectives.
some of them.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at the hypocrisy, that was not always a part of Puritanism.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that it arose. I mean, Malthus is a